Hey guys, what's up? It's Zyflin here, and today we're going to be talking about the damage changes that were announced last night on the recent dev stream. So this is coming from Dev Workshop, Enemy Resistances and Status Rework. I'm going to have this linked down in the description below if you want to read along with this video. But basically, this is DE, their next attempt at further simplifying the damage types within Warframe. Now, they have tried to do this quite a bit over the years of myself playing this game, and a lot of the time they sort of talk about it on dev stream, and then it takes a very long time for the changes to be implemented or come out or be finalized, that there type of stuff. As far as I'm aware, this is supposed to be coming with the upcoming Jade update, so hopefully we'll see all of the stuff being added into the game with that update. But everything that we're going to talk about in today's video is basically to be decided. It's not finalized at all, so this is all just sort of theory crafting at the minute. But we're going to go ahead and go through, and I'm going to give my take on this whole sort of debacle, because you have a lot of players who straight up just don't understand, and then you have a lot of players on the sort of end game side of things that are like, this just kind of seems to make the game easier, and it kind of does. So let's go ahead and go through. So this post was made by DE Sam, and he says, "Hey Tedo, as we continue our pursuit of quality of life changes, we believe the time has come to revisit how we handle enemy health types, resistances and weaknesses, and a few status effects." So basically they're talking about addressing, how enemies take more damage or take less damage. Let's get into it. Please keep in mind that much of this is a concept and prone to further changes as we gear near the Jade Shadows update. Right now, your enemies in Warframe boast 13 unique health types. Now, that in of itself can confuse a new player, because you're like, what do you mean some bad guys have 13 unique health types? So yeah, we'll talk about that as we go on. In addition, players can explore 13 damage types and statuses achieved largely through mods or are intrinsic to your weapon, so they can be on your weapon from the get-go. Now, each health type is resistant to a few status damage types and weak to another few. For the players that don't know, we have the following health types. So this is basically all of the different health types organized by faction. So the Grenier have cloned flesh, they have ferrite armor, they have alloy armor, and they have machinery, and each of those takes more or less damage from different damage types in the game. Same for Corpus, so they have flesh, shields, proto shield, robotic, ferrite armor, alloy armor. Infested just have infested, then they have infested flesh, then they have fossilized, then they have infested sinew, then they have ferrite armor. The Sentients have flesh, robotic, ferrite armor, alloy armor, shields. The Murmur have indifferent facade, ferrite armor, infested, and machinery. And what you'll notice is basically every single faction has at least one type of armor, which makes corrosive sort of like heavy meta for just dealing, a lot of damage from the get-go. So most newer players, you're throwing on corrosive damage onto your weapons, and then you can throw fire damage on. That's going to strip armor from enemies even further. So corrosive fire is a go-to sort of like elemental combination setup, and then viral fire or viral heat is also another go-to, because it allows you to deal more damage directly to enemies' health. So if they don't have armor, or even if you're applying slash procs to enemies, then the viral is going to amplify the damage dealt directly to the enemy's health. And we can see here, this is all the different elemental damage types and physical damage types that we have in the game. So we have physical on the left, we have impact, puncture, and slash. Then we have the cold, electric, heat, toxin, so that's the single element. And then we have the combined elements, which is blast, corrosive, gas, magnetic, radiation, and viral. They go on to say, as you can see, there are a lot of potential combinations. These all have different interactions with enemy health types, and none are easily presented in game, creating confusion as to what hurts or doesn't what. That information not being easily presented in game is the first issue that they're trying to fix. So if you actually wanted to see which damage types deal more damage to a certain type of enemy, you'd have to go and scan that enemy into the codex. So you'd have to scan them multiple times to get all the information in, and then you have to look over here. So you see ferrite armor, you see the puncture symbol and the corrosive symbol. They have pluses, right? So the puncture has 2 pluses, so each plus represents about 25%. So you deal 50% extra damage with puncture, and you deal 75% damage or extra damage with corrosive. But that's only against the ferrite armor. If you strip away this enemy's armor, then he has cloned flesh, as you can see. So it deals extra damage from slash, from fire, and from viral, like we talked about before. They move on to say that their design goal for this rework is to address the overly complex enemy resistance and armor systems, so players have more freedom while building their loadouts. I don't necessarily think that we're going to have more freedom. There's still going to be go-to like elemental and physical damage setups that you want to run depending on the faction that you're going against. I suppose we could see a world where you could run like, let's say, corrosive damage on your primary and then viral on your secondary to, apply those viral procs and stuff like that. But we basically already do that. They would just be making things more effective than they already are, if that makes any sense. So I don't think we're going to get more freedom. I think there's definitely still going to be a go-to meta whenever it comes to certain factions and stuff like that. So for example, fighting against the Corpus, if they don't change toxin damage in some way, then toxin damage is still going to go through enemy shields. Therefore, toxin is still going to be the go-to damage type to mod for whenever you're going against Corpus, right? So that's just one example. They say this rework addresses three core issues that we frequently see whenever it comes to status effects and resistances. So number one, damage types and status effects currently encourage a meta that favors a select few effects, which probably still will be the case after this rework, let's be real. Enemy resistances are incredibly expansive with little presentation to show what affects what, and armor has an overwhelming impact, limiting builds to deal with armor. We aim to streamline faction health types and defenses such as armor and shields to promote more accessible player loadout building. As well, several status effects will receive additional changes, namely Blast, Cold, Gas, and Magnetic. So they talk about new health types and faction resistances, so let's create an example. You bring a loadout of pure viral /slash. If you're fighting the Greeneer on Earth, the slash status activating bleed is amplified by viral status, and bleed bypasses armor to destroy your foes. But slash damage does less damage to both ferrite and ally armor, and has no beneficial difference to machinery. In order to maximize damage against Grenier, you'd think to stock your loadout with Puncture, Corrosive, and Radiation. Blast is also especially effective against machinery. Clearly, there are far too many things to juggle here, ultimately resulting in the one-stop shop of viral slash. Something that I keep on saying about Warframe, like nowadays, is that we're spoiled for choice whenever it comes to like the different builds that we can make. And even though we're making these changes to, the factions and the status types and stuff like that, we're still gonna be spoiled for choice because we have so many different damage types in the game. We have 3 physical, we have 4, base elements, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different combined statuses, right? So there is still going to be a lot to juggle, I think. Let's just keep on reading the post. So they talk about streamlining enemy health. So let's simplify the system. Health, armor, and shields, which is kind of how I go about explaining it nowadays anyway. So your red health bar is just the enemy's health, the yellow health bar is enemy with armor, and then the blue health bar is the enemy with shields. So all flesh types become health, alloy or ferrite armor just becomes armor, and the difference between proto shields just folds into shields. So they say instead of 13 enemy health types to juggle, we can work with 3 to better develop faction resistances and weaknesses and create a more approachable system. I actually think this is a really good change because it's going to simplify it for newer players coming into the game. So versus yellow, you use corrosive. Versus red, you use like slash and viral. Versus blue, you use magnetic and toxin, something along those lines. Now they say resistances become more about the faction. We can then recommend appropriate per faction resistances, which will then universally affect that specific enemy group. As such, the star chart will show recommended faction resistances per planet, align with the present faction. There will be listed weaknesses and resistances to communicate the recommended option for damage against any specific faction or location. So they show a screenshot here, and this is basically on Jupiter, which is the Corpus, as you guys know. So it says Corpus, enemy level 25 to 30, and then at the bottom there, it shows suggested damage, which is plus 25 to impact and then plus 25 to magnetic. This is definitely a work in progress image. Like, there's no way this is going to be the final thing that they ship out because they don't show the whole like toxin bypasses shields and toxin is good versus Corpus, right? And I guess it really depends on what they want to promote. Like if they just want to make people build for the best elemental combination, which would be magnetic, then them just showing magnetic is good. But like if they want people to sort of like, I don't know, get better at the game, right? They should be recommending toxin here, right? Magnetic and toxin or something like that. So then, the game is a lot easier. You know what I mean? So it just depends on their intention, what they want to put forth to the player, I guess. So they did mention in the dev stream very briefly that they wanted to still sort of like give room for the player to discover like better elemental combos and setups and stuff like that. So I don't know, we just have to wait and see for this change to actually be added into the game, because a lot of this, like I said, it's work in progress. We don't know what the final product is actually going to be like, and only then, once we get the actual rework, can we critique it properly. So they say if multiple factions exist on a planet, such as the Murmur or Infested on Deimos, then those separate factions will have their own resistances and weaknesses, which will be communicated. Regardless of specialized resistances, status effects will continue to work the same, even if the enemy is resistant to that damage type. If enemies are present with shields, but the node dictates resistances to magnetic damage, the status effect will still hinder the effectiveness of the shields themselves. As well, damage resistances won't change just because an enemy's armor or shields are removed. Since they're set per faction, those weaknesses or resistances will continue to affect whatever health type they have equally. So this is quite an interesting line because it's like, okay, if an enemy has armor and you strip away that armor, so let's say the armor takes more damage from corrosive, the enemy is still going to take more damage from corrosive, which makes it a lot easier to mod versus enemies and deal more damage to enemies, right? So armor scaling is a big thing in Warframe, and they do talk about that a little bit more in this post, but basically what this reads is the game is going to get a lot easier because you're going to have to worry less about having the right damage type for, you know, if the enemy has armor or shields or not. So if you take a mission and that mission says, hey, these bad guys are weak to corrosive, those bad guys are always going to take more damage from corrosive damage, no matter what, no matter if they have shields, no matter if they have armor. So this part to me doesn't really make any sense. They say within a faction, the status type resistances and weaknesses can vary based on location. For example, regular Grineer may have different resistances and weaknesses than Kuva Grineer. This may not always be needed, but we believe it can add some flavor and variety. Now, if we go back up in the post, they talk about, you know, how there's too many different, like, you know, armor types and health types in the game, and that can become too much to juggle. And then they're like, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make it so that a faction, so the Grineer, as an umbrella term, they're going to take more damage from a certain elemental damage type, right? And that's just going to be it. But then they say, oh yeah, but there's also Kuva Grineer, so we're going to change up like the different, you know, things that they're weak and resistant to. And it's like, bro, you're basically creating the same problem, right? Just make it so that the Grineer are weak to corrosive and heat, for example, and then just call it a day. Like what they should do to add more flavor and variety is just make it so that the boss enemies take more damage from radiation. So you know, okay, the Grineer grunts, they take more damage from corrosive and heat. The Corpus grunts take more damage from magnetic and toxin. Then the infested, you could say corrosive and heat again, just as an example. And then boss enemies in those factions will take more damage from, you know, I don't know, let's say a boss enemy in the Corpus takes more damage from gas because we need a reason to actually run gas on anything outside of like specific setups, right? So those boss enemies will take more damage from gas, or the boss enemies within the Grineer faction or Murmur faction, they take more damage from radiation, that their type of thing. So here they just go on to explain what they're talking about. For demonstrative purposes, let's say that the Grineer on Earth are weak to corrosive and heat. You bring corrosive and heat doing increased damage to all present enemies within that respective faction, but then your chosen status effect will continue to work independently as expected. So maybe you'd swap corrosive for viral or bring viral via a secondary. Viral status effect will then affect your weapon with corrosive or heat massively to all present foes. So basically, what we have in the game already, if you have a viral primer in some way, shape, or form, and you shoot at a bad guy, the damage is going to be amplified, right? So that is staying the same. Now, instead of having your status being effective against a few enemies and neutral to many others, your chosen damage type becomes more universally effective while being able to lean into your tried and true status effects. With this, status juggling between 13 unseen health and defensive types has been reduced, enable you to build easily for a faction through 2 statuses and your own preferred playstyle. Like, this sort of like little bit here, in my opinion, we already do this. Like we already bring primers to amplify our damage in certain ways and stuff like that. So this is kind of, in my opinion at least, a mute point. Now we move on to talk about armor. So they're like, armor is king, most applicably on Grineer, also corrupted and stuff like that. So Grineer effective health, also known as effective hit points, is the amount of actual health an enemy has, including damage resistance. So for example, a non-steel path heavy gunner at level 200 has 104,805 HP. Then they have 10,815 ferrite armor, creating a 97% damage reduction, ultimately leading to 3.8 million whatever health. That's a big jump from 104,000 just off of the damage reduction alone. So it's no secret that the Grineer armor scales their effective health to often crazy numbers, making an armor strip that much more important. And without armor strip, players rely on viral slash and heat to work around this, as corrosive struggles to reduce damage reduction to a level that feels useful to players. So at 10 corrosive stacks, the heavy gunner remains at 87% damage reduction. Long story short, viral slash and heat is just kind of the meta in the game, because viral and slash more damage directly to the enemy's health regardless if they have armor or not, and then heat is able to reduce the enemy's armor too. So to address this issue, we aim to do the following. Enemy armor will cap out at a certain percentage to give corrosive armor reducing stacks more of an active impact. The armor scaling curve will aim to be a bit more spread out as opposed to being bottom heavy. Partial strip from the top end will allow for more consistent damage gains as opposed to needing to have a total armor strip. So they're going to have a minimum threshold of enemy armor, so no armor accessing enemy will have below a certain minimum. Armor shouldn't feel unimpactful. Health scaling of Grenier enemies will be realigned to an extent to help compensate for the loss in damage reduction and to try and maintain a similar time to kill feel. This should reduce the feeling for necessary total armor strip while making partial armor strip more impactful. Player's armor is to be untouched. So basically what they're doing here is they're making it so that the Grenier enemies, or any armored enemy for that matter, is going to have a cap as to how much armor they can actually have. And then if you were to bring something like, let's say, Hildren's Pillage ability on your frame, and you go ahead and you strip away an enemy's armor, right? Because that ability alone, it's quite hard to get the full armor strip from in one cast because you need a very high amount of power strength. Basically, if it only strips away a percentage of the enemy's armor, you're gonna feel more of an impact once these changes come in. Now that the enemy's armor is reduced to like a certain percentage, right? So let's say their armor is at like 90% or whatever, and you strip it all the way down to 10%, you're gonna see your damage be totally like amplified by a great amount now. That doesn't mean that totally stripping away the enemy's armor is now useless. That is still going to amplify your damage a lot, because you're going to totally get rid of that whole damage reduction portion that they're going for. So let's say if the enemy's health keeps on scaling up and up and up and up and up, so they get to level 9,000 or whatever, and then you strip away their armor, that level 9,000 enemy is going to remain to be easy to kill whenever he has no armor. Like, he's going to be easier to kill with no armor than if he even had 10 armor. Does that make sense? So enemy armor across the board is going to be reduced or capped to a certain amount. Player armor strip, so being able to strip away the enemy's armor, is getting basically buffed, even if you're not completely armor stripping. But completely armor stripping is still going to be very, very, very strong for dealing more damage. It's just not going to be totally necessary anymore to completely armor strip the enemies. Next up, we're moving on to shields. So the Grenier are tankier by design, but the Corpus try to make the difference through their shields. However, Corpus effective hit points is significantly lower, making them often trivial to deal with. Our goal is to reduce the discrepancy between Grenier and Corpus time to kill through their shields by making Corpus shields a bit more challenging and interesting to fight. Here, our goal is to provide some scaling factors to shield regeneration and delay, designed to create a more perceivable benefit of affecting status effects, particularly at higher levels. Such scaling factors may look like enemy shields having a shorter regeneration delay when depleted, enemy shields having a shorter regeneration delay when hit, and enemy shields regenerating faster. Players early in the game and at lower levels in general will still be able to power through shields, as the factoring, like other stats, will be less noticeable. However, the impact of status effects like magnetic will be much more perceivable at higher levels. And then it also says that players' shields are going to be untouched. So essentially, they want to make the Corpus more tanky and harder to kill, bring it more in line with the Grenier enemies whenever the enemy levels start to sort of scale up. But the thing is, they're talking a lot about shields here, and that literally won't matter if Toxin remains the same, because Toxin bypasses the shields, right? So this post says nothing about any changes to Toxin, and that's why it has a lot of players in a panic, because we don't really know what their intention is whenever it comes to, you know, these damage types. Are they going to change Toxin? Or is it going to completely change up how we mod, and it's going to make like a lot of the content and the overframe builds and stuff like that that we put together, is it going to totally switch up what we should be recommending to newer players and stuff like that? They also say, notably, enemies starting from levels closer to 100 will see faster rates in which they gain stats, so health, shields, etc. And now we move on to the status effect changes. So with a slew of new resistances changes, armor adjustments, and health changes, we wanted to revisit the status effects that are generally less used in the community. Again, everything is prone to changes as we lead into Jade Shadows. So we're talking about blast damage here, so they just said more to come. Our concepts and ideas with blast are rapidly changing. No specifics will be made as of right now. Basically, they're just saying, oh, it's on the radar. Then they talk about cold. So our goal with cold is to emphasize the effectiveness of the fantasy of slowing and freezing your enemies. Cold now has a new effect where you freeze your enemies upon reaching the new cold stack maximum. So cold has a new stack cap, so it's going to freeze enemies for a few seconds after inflicting all of the amount of status effects for cold that you can. Then while frozen, critical damage is greatly increased. So are they going to give us like a big crit damage multiplier now whenever an enemy is totally frozen? That would be cool. So how do frozen enemies deal with additional damage? They don't regenerate shields. Weapons and warframes that deal cold will be updated to reflect this new behavior, and freeze may synergize with other status effects such as bleed. VIP enemies such as acolytes, bosses, etc. can't be completely frozen. They'll also be immune to the frozen inflicted critical damage increase naturally, which is kind of sad. Cold could become a really cool element to run, no pun intended. So you could do like a corrosive cold build, and if it's amplifying your crit damage by a great amount, then it could be very powerful. But if they don't like give us a decent crit multiplier on the frozen enemy, that is not really going to matter because you can already get like crazy crit multipliers on your weapons anyway. So that's a point to keep in mind. We move on to talk about gas. So gas often lacks effective readability, making it difficult to distinguish its presence from the enemy or yourself. It's important to introduce enhanced visuals for the gas status, so its presence is noticeably present. Lots of P words there. Some ideas that we had, which are very prone to change. So extend the range of the gas cloud effects based on the range of the status. Additional effects added to effective enemies to communicate status activity. Gas effects having billowy volume to better present presence. Gas effects having additional floating particles around the smoke. Enemy gas effects having additional red coloring to communicate a threat to players. So they're not actually changing anything to do with, gas damage or the gas status effect here, literally just visual changes, which is a little bit weird. Saying is, gas isn't an element which is used a lot. It can be very strong in the right circumstances, but you don't recommend to a player, hey, throw gas damage on your gun unless you're doing something specific, like let's say a gas hammer slam build or something like that. And then we talk about magnetic. So it says, while magnetic won't be getting dramatic changes, our goal is to make the status a stronger pick against corpus and shielded enemies. As mentioned, magnetic aims to have an updated status effect behavior that'll affect the regen delay and regenerate and reset delay of enemy shields. Additionally, we're interested in the idea that magnetic damage type will have improved effectiveness against nullifier bubbles. That's pretty cool in my opinion. Currently, this would look like increased maximum damage against nullifier bubbles and increased maximum damage against nullifier bubbles. And that is basically it. So then they move on to talk about magnetic. So they say that while magnetic won't be getting any dramatic changes, our goal is to make the status a stronger pick against corpus and shielded enemies. As mentioned, magnetic aims to have an updated status effect behavior that'll affect the regen delay and regenerate and reset delay of enemy shields. Additionally, we're interested in the idea that magnetic damage type will have improved effectiveness against nullifier bubbles, which would be kind of cool. Currently, this would look like increased minimum damage against nullifier bubbles and increased maximum damage against nullifier bubbles. So you're just dealing more damage versus those nullifier bubbles across the board if you're running magnetic damage, which sounds like a good idea. So what are my closing thoughts on how they're going to change up damage and status effects and enemy health and resistances, weaknesses, etc., etc.? I don't think that it is necessarily going to change too much. It might give us a little bit more like flexibility. It might introduce like more sort of like optimal ways to deal with certain factions that we haven't thought about before, and they may or they may not basically like say, hey, instead of corrosive and heat being good versus let's say the infested, for example, now it's like gas and something, and that is going to be most effective versus the infested, right? They could make sweeping changes like that where they just decide, hey, these elemental status effects or damage types, they are kind of underused. Let's make it so that these specific damage types deal more damage versus this specific faction, and therefore we have to make more specific builds for certain types of enemies and stuff like that. But I don't think that anything too major is going to change. Of course, I could be totally wrong about that, but just based on this post alone, it sounds like they don't have a lot of like solid ideas. Like, okay, they want to make magnetic better versus shields. It already is good versus shields, but they just want to make it better, and that's okay. That's totally fine. They didn't say anything about changing toxin or whatever. They just want to make some things better. So I think most things are going to stay the same. Like magnetic and toxin is still going to be good versus corpus. You know, corrosive and heat is still going to be good versus the armored enemies. Radiation is still going to be good versus like VIP enemies and stuff like that. But I think the only thing that really has bothered me is this whole, you know, the Grineer on Earth are going to be weak to a certain type of element, but then the Grineer that are in the Kuva Fortress, they're not going to be weak to the exact same stuff. And if their goal is to just make things simpler and easier to understand for newer players, so the newer players can have a more enjoyable time with the game, let's be honest, they shouldn't keep on switching things up. Like, I think it would be cool they just have rules in the game where corrosive and heat is the go-to versus the Grineer enemies, magnetic and toxin is the go-to versus the corpus enemies, and I don't know, whatever new damage types they want to make good versus the infested, they could totally do that as well. And then whenever it comes to, you know, running different elements on different weapons and stuff like that, I thought originally that was what the corrupted faction was for, because it mixed all those different factions into the one. So that way it might be effective to run, like, I don't know, a melee weapon which is good versus the infested, or a primary weapon which is good versus the Grineer, and then a secondary which is good versus the corpus, because those three different factions would be in the corrupted, and then, you know, you could have those different weapons to deal more damage versus the specific enemies within the corrupted faction that are actually just from the Grineer, Corpus, and infested faction. So in conclusion, I don't think that these changes are going to affect how we mod, because keep in mind, they did say that the whole point of this is to try to bring more freedom whenever it comes to modding your weapons, right? More variety and stuff like that. So they're just going to make it so that you have more options pretty much. And if you want to stick with running like your viral heat or whatever, you could probably definitely do that. Like, I don't think our builds are going to change up that much. I just worry about how this is going to sort of like impact newer players. Is it going to make the game easier or more complicated to understand? For example, this user Voltage makes a really good point. So they said they really like the changes, but telling players to use impact damage in the fashion presented is sort of misleading. So if we go back up to the screenshot here, and you can see that they're like, oh, suggested damage, impact, and magnetic, right? So the new player looks at that and he's like, okay, I want to add impact damage onto my weapon, right? So he types in impact and he's throwing on the Rupture mod. And to the keen eye, everybody knows that this is a totally useless mod to be throwing on, because it only increases your impact portion of your damage by 15%. So it takes 15% of the impact damage on your weapon and then adds that on top. It's far more worth it for you to run an element, even an element which isn't the right elemental type. It's better for you to run that than to run Rupture in this circumstance. In most circumstances, actually, because it takes your impact, puncture, and slash stat and then gives you a new damage type, which is going to be better or worse versus certain enemies depending on the faction that you're playing against. So Rupture just isn't a mod that's ever worth it. And like recommending that a player mods for IPS or impact, puncture, slash whenever the weapon's total damage needs to be made up of like 90, 95%, 100% of that damage type to be worth using the rare versions, so like Crash Course in this example, yes, definitely misleading. And again, it's like, so my first question is Toxin going to retain its shield bypass? Because if so, yeah, all of the shield changes that they're recommending basically just are null and void, right? Because just, okay, we're going to mod for Toxin, and the Corpus are still going to die to our Toxin damage through their shield. So these shield changes just won't matter. Omi Numi, this is very limited info, 110%, because we don't know what they're going to do. And I do agree with Razorlight here in the comments. So he says, this stuff is incredible, but it won't solve one big issue. Changing loadouts manually is tiresome. And I think this is the crux of the issue. This is a complaint that I have heard for years whenever it comes to playing Warframe. And it doesn't matter what the sort of current meta is. Everybody wants one go-to loadout with one go-to elemental type. They don't want to be bothered swapping all the time because, of course, like, this game already demands a lot of your time. Why waste even more time swapping between loadouts? They should just add in the config system, actually, and just change the names to Grineer, Corpus, and Infested, then Corrupted and Murmur once you unlock those factions. And then whenever you play a mission which has one of those factions, it just automatically selects that loadout for you, right? So you spend a little bit of time in the modding section putting together loadouts for those specific factions, and then it auto equips when you play a mission versus that certain faction. That would be great, and it would basically like teach people the game even better. At least I think, because you'd have to use the right elements and stuff like that. It sort of forces you to build properly, and you'll see the benefits of that in your gameplay. You would jump into a corpus mission, like if you only bothered to mod your Grenier loadout on your Bratton or whatever, you could jump into that corpus mission and you'll be like, where's all my damage? And then you take a look and you'd see, oh, I don't have any mods for the corpus faction, I need to deal with that. And they could literally have a pop-up on the screen that's like, you must apply mods to your corpus loadout on your Bratton or whatever before you can play this mission, and then basically forces the player to do that. We could sit and we could talk about damage types in Warframe basically all day. My take is the simpler it is to understand for players, the better, because obviously more people playing the game, more people are going to benefit. It isn't overly complicated in a game like Destiny, for example, and look how successful that was. And yes, I do agree that like part of the appeal with Warframe is how sort of complex it can be, but at the same time, from like a new player acquisition standpoint and player retention standpoint, they need to make this game a lot easier, because I've seen a lot of people throughout the years just not understanding how damage types and stuff work. And on top of that, changing how damage in Warframe works has been a topic of conversation basically the entire 10 years or 11 years this game has been like out, because it is complicated and people don't understand it. And I wish that they would just find something that they are happy with, so we don't have to worry about constantly changing the advice that we give new players. That is my conclusion. Thank you guys for watching. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe for more Warframe content, and I will see you guys in the next one.